meaningless. Well, I won't bore you with that discussion. I only push in this direction to give myself a way of moving slowly into the topic, and also to give you a sense of how endless are the possibilities of discourse under the Constitution, and how hard it is to make a meaningful judgment of whether someone is well suited to leading the Constitution's exegesis in the United States. And remember, this fellow is going to be Chief Justice not just of the Supreme Court, contrary to the way some commentators refer to him. He will be Chief Justice of the United States of America. That's the official title. Chief Justice of you and of me, as it were. Well, turning to talk of the Roberts legacy, I've got very little choice but to play Hamlet without the prince. I've got to talk about the Roberts legacy even before we have a Roberts court. In a way, that's quite fitting, because as any of you who heard Roberts testify and then read the transcript or even looked at the newspaper excerpts could probably tell, there was a lot less there than met the ear. The Roberts persona was powerfully present. One could draw certain inferences about the spirit in which he might approach the job. He's friendly. He's brilliant. I can testify to that quite directly. He was a student in my constitutional law course in the fall of 1977. Even more significant, his grade didn't quite reflect his brilliance. But that often happens, and from now on I'll be able to use that as a wonderful example at the end of the course, not to put him down, but to say, you can actually get somewhere in this life if you get only an A- in this course. It's not required that you be at the absolute top in everything. I tell people about how Derek Bach gave me a flat B in one course, although I didn't until this moment name him as the person who gave me a B. And see, I still managed to survive. In any event, he's clearly brilliant. The few inferences that one could draw about the starting premises that Roberts would bring to the Constitution, about the constitutionally acceptable place of religion in public life, really nothing there in the testimony, or about the constitutional balance to be drawn between private property and values of community, one of the most fundamental issues. Really nothing there. The values of community, yes, we heard something about. The values of self-government, the values of democracy, and also the rights of property. But where the rubber hits the road and where one must decide where one ends and the other begins, nothing. The concrete contours of personal privacy in the contested zone where the state and the individual fight it out over certain basic decisions, or where the state fights it out with intimate associations, whether it be a married couple or the family more broadly defined, or something very unlike the family but nonetheless intimate. The contours of that aspect of privacy really were not illuminated. How one defines the boundaries of Congress's commerce power vis-a-vis the states, really a blank, as he was pressed on whether he would defer to Congress's factual findings on purely factual questions. Does a particular hapless toad, to use a phrase that he used in one of his environmental opinions, ever wander outside the boundaries of California? Yes or no? Well, if Congress held elaborate hearings, hired spies to follow the toad, considered evidence, put toads on the stand for all I know, reached conclusions, the court would hardly second-guess them. That much Roberts tells us. But if Congress says, we don't care if the toad spends its entire life in California, it's enough for us that the particular activity involved in this case, which is a building development in San Diego, which happens to take the toad and destroy it, is itself an activity that is somehow connected to commerce. Well, is that or is that not enough to make this an exercise of the commerce power? Roberts didn't decide that, but he thought it was a question that was not approached in a manner by his colleagues on the D.C. Circuit that was fully consistent with Supreme Court precedent, so it should be reheard. Well, that's an opinion of his that tells us a little about his view of that boundary, a little, but very little, and he wasn't really questioned in a way that would have shed further light on it. So the fears of those who care deeply about the environment or about global warming, that this is someone who would have too cramped a view of Congress's commerce power to protect the interests of mankind, went unexplored, and there's no basis for decision based on those views. Of course, one could decide a good bit of this through a concept that if Roberts were on trial, we might describe as a burden of proof. We might say, since Roberts is not accused of doing anything wrong, is not threatened with being deprived of anything to which he has a right, instead of his being presumed innocent until proven guilty, instead of the government bearing the burden of proof, this is much more like a job interview by the American people, the way both Biden and Kennedy tried to picture it. This is something he wants, to which he isn't entitled, and what's at stake isn't so much his rights versus the rights of the Senate committee. Burden of proof rules, rules about how we act in the face of uncertainty, are apt here only if we understand this is not like a trial, only if we understand that the question really is, should the public have to be satisfied that Roberts would be a safe custodian of the American Constitution and its chief interpreter? Or should one assume, because he's been, after all, nominated by the President, whose abilities to make personnel selections like Brownie at FEMA are legendary, but I have promised many people that I would not become partisan, so you will disregard that last comment. Should one assume that structurally, because after all the people elected, at least this time, elected George W. Bush president? I have to stop.